The Kennebec River runs gently down through the wooded uplands of Maine to the sea. Its source is Moosehead Lake, a stretch of water so large that it was once mistaken for the China Sea. From this great lake, the Kennebec flows 150 miles south through New England before draining into the North Atlantic near a windy point of land called Sabino Head. It was here that 400 years ago, a fortress was built by Englishmen used by other Englishmen as their chattels or slaves. Fort St. George would be formidable had it survived. A blueprint discovered nearly 300 years later shows it with thick battlements, great crenelled gates, several mansions, a church, 50 other buildings, and a walled garden. A dozen cannon point towards the sea. Construction was well underway when the settlement was suddenly deserted, leaving the fort to crumble back into the earth. Today, the fort exists as the merest outline etched in the landscape, revealing little of the philosophy or vision that impelled men to build it. The settlement was the project of Sir John Popham, one of the most powerful men in the government of Queen Elizabeth I. Popham was the first to put to test Sir Humphrey Gilbert's proposal for colonizing America with the dregs of England. What Popham tried would one day be one of the most hated features of English rule in America. Ambitions, buried at Fort St. George, were to live on and change the face of North America. Work on the short-lived fortress had begun in August of 1607. It was to be the centerpiece of a new colony. A charter issued the previous year by King James I restated England's claim to Virginia. The entire length of the eastern American seaboard, from Canada to Florida, and authorized the establishment of 2 colonies. One, under the aegis of Sir Thomas Smith, was to be in the south, between the 38th and 41st parallels. The other, under the guidance of the Lord Chief Justice Sir John Popham, was to be located in the north, in New England. The charter signaled a new approach to England's hoped-for conquest and share in the New World. Previously, all England's colonial ventures in America had been individualistic forays, each one ultimately dependent on the vision, finances, and staying power of one man. By the early 1600s, this was starting to be recognized as a fatal weakness. An anonymous broadside circulating at the time reflected on 20 years of failure, quote, "Private purses are cold comfort to adventurers, and have ever been found fatal to all enterprises hitherto undertaken by the English, by reason of delays, jealousies, and unwillingness to back that project which succeeded not at the first attempt." The broadside argued for a stock, a joint stock company that could take a long view and ride the kind of setbacks that had been the ruin of so many previous ventures. Joint stock companies were relatively new entities in which individuals owned shares and they could sell without reference to their fellow stockholders. These companies were opening the far corners of the globe to English trade, so why not a joint stock company to fund the next big English push to colonize America? Interest in America had been largely dormant since 1590, when the financial drain persuaded Walter Raleigh to give up his Roanoke adventure. 12 years went by, and then a new round of exploration began. It was led by Bartholomew Gosnold, a friend of Richard Hakluyt and Raleigh. Accompanied by Bartholomew Gilbert, one of Sir Humphrey Gilbert's 6 sons, Gosnold, landed in New England in 1602 and stayed for several months, trading and exploring. They returned with sensational reports that rhapsodied over the natural riches of the New World. Quote, "The soil is fat and lusty, cherry trees like ours, but the stalks bear the blossom or fruit, which are like a cluster of grapes. All sorts of fowls, whose young ones we took and ate at our pleasure. Ground nuts as big as eggs." Gosnold summed up their reaction as they caught the first sight of all this plenty. "We stood a while as ravished." The following year, a merchant from Bristol, Martin Pring, landed in Virginia looking for the sassafras tree, the root of which was then used to treat the French pox, and is today, in a marvelous piece of serendipity, used in the perfumery trade. 2 years after Pring, George Weymouth came down looking for a settlement site in what is now Maine. Pring and Weymouth were down-to-earth seamen, with none of Gosnold's descriptive flair. but they did enough to stoke the fires of enthusiasm for America still more. Quote, "The land is full of God's good blessings," said Pring. Weymouth made the same point more graphically, returning with intriguing samples of plant and animal life and 5 captured Native Americans, all London wanted to see. Despite the fact that Gosnold and other mariners had found not a scrap of evidence for the existence of gold mines, these expeditions sparked new speculation about gold waiting to be discovered in America. The fantastical stories of golden cities, brought back 3 decades earlier by that wandering seaman David Ingram, had not been forgotten, and American gold became the talk of the taverns and counting houses. The Spanish dream of El Dorado, the Golden Man, had led to the discovery of fantastic treasures in South America. The English, it was argued, would find theirs in the northern continent. A taste of the fantastic hopes that developed can be had from Ben Jonson's satire on gold fever, Eastward Ho!, staged at the same time as Shakespeare was putting on Macbeth. Johnson imagines the lost Roanoke colonists marrying into the local population and living in a society literally covered in gold. "Why, man," exclaims a character, "all their dripping pans are pure gold, and all the chains with which they chain up their streets are massy gold. All the prisoners they take are fettered in gold, and for rubies and diamonds they go forth on holidays and gather 'em by the seashore." It was in this atmosphere that the charter authorizing the 2 new forays into America was drawn up, and 2 joint stock companies of knights, gentlemen, merchants, and other adventurers created for the purpose. The 2 principal aims were announced as bringing infidels and savages living in those parts to human civility and the mining of gold, silver, and copper. 3 of the Crown's leading counselors helped draft the document: Robert Cecil, Chief Secretary of State, Sir Edward Coke, Attorney General, and the fearsome Lord Chief Justice, Sir John Popham. Cecil emerged as principal patron of the company that was allocated the Southern Territory, lying roughly between what is now Florida and New York. It was composed of men drawn mainly from our city of London, and inevitably became known as the London Company, and later the Virginia Company. The key post of treasurer of the company, equivalent to managing director, was taken by Sir Thomas Smith. Sir John Popham was the principal investor in the second company, drawn from our cities of Bristol and Exeter and of our town of Plymouth, and allocated New England. It came to be known as the Plymouth Company. Popham was a man whose character was written in his face. In one portrait, he appears a physical giant, the scarlet robes of the High Court clutched around his bulk, a heavy, ugly face glaring out, cold eyes cunning and suspicious. The face of a calculating, unstoppable bully. In his voluminous Lives of the Chief Justices of England, Lord Campbell refers to the portrait and adds decorously, "I am afraid he would not appear to great advantage in a sketch of his moral qualities, which, lest I do him an injustice, I will not attempt." Sir John was the man who had passed the death sentence on Sir Walter Raleigh, telling him, quote, "It is best for man not to seek to climb too high, lest he fall." He had participated in the trial of Mary, Queen of Scots, and condemned to death Guy Fawkes and hundreds more. The miracle was that he did not join them on the gallows himself. Before he occupied one by one most of the great legal offices of state, John Popham had become a highwayman, and according to one rumor, probably a garroter too. Popham was born in 1531 into an affluent Somerset family. He read law at Balliol College, Oxford, and in his 20s he was called to the bar and respectably married. Even then, however, he was exhibiting a different side to his character. He was a heavy drinker and a gambler, and according to Lord Campbell, either to supply his profligate expenditure or to show his spirit, Popham would, quote, frequently sallied forth at night from a hostel in Southwark with a band of desperate characters, and planting themselves in ambush on Shooter's Hill, or taking other positions favorable for attack and escape, they stopped travelers and took from them not only their money, but any valuable commodities they carried with them, boasting that they were always civil and generous, and that to avoid serious consequences, they went in such numbers as to render resistance impossible. Popham's antics continued right through his 20s. Amazingly, he was never caught. In his 30s, he decided he would make as much money from the law as from highway robbery and developed an extensive practice in southwest England that brought him to the attention of the Queen. With her rare ability to pick a ruthless talent that could be used one day, Elizabeth arranged a seat in Parliament for him. The former highwayman became Speaker of the House, then Attorney General, and finally, Lord Chief Justice. He was a hanging judge, says Campbell. Ordinary larcenies, and above all, in highway robbery, there was little chance of acquittal. It was the same with those who did not fit the Protestant orthodoxies the Crown was trying to mold. Sir John pursued outspoken Puritans and Catholic priests to the scaffold. Under him, hundreds of Jesuits and suspected sympathizers were sent to Tyburn or Smithfield to be hanged, drawn and quartered, or, if a woman, perhaps to be crushed to death or strangled before being burnt at the stake. When it came to the rich, Sir John could be lenient if the price was right. There was no more corrupt age than the Elizabethan, and the future Lord Chief Justice proved himself as viable as any. In the 1580s, a midwife's story horrified all who heard it. She told of being taken blindfold into a closed coach to attend the delivery of a child in a great house, and after the birth, seeing a masked man seize the newborn infant and cast it into the fire, where it perished. When the story became known, a hue and a cry was raised for the perpetrator of what Lord Macaulay called this horrible and mysterious crime. The murderer was tracked down, only to be let off after he paid the judge in the case a truly massive bribe in the shape of his mansion, Littlecote Hall in Wiltshire. John Popham was the judge. By this and other means, he became a very rich man. He left behind him the greatest estate that has ever been amassed by any lawyer. This intimidating man was involved in colonialism years before the Plymouth Company was created. In the 1580s, the Queen decided to stamp out rebellion forever in Munster by confiscating the vast estates there of the Desmond family and repopulating them with English Protestants. Catholic Irish were ordered out, and the land was offered at twopence an acre to English landlords who would undertake to plant it with tenants from England. Popham was one of many who saw himself accumulating a huge Irish estate. He assembled more than 80 families and dispatched them to Munster. However, another English worthy was already off the mark and had tenanted the land, leaving Popham's tenants no choice but to return home. A few decades later, a not dissimilar scheme called the headright system would be introduced in America, and the wealthy would become still richer by obtaining grants of land for importing the poor to settle the New World. The experience in Munster did not deter Popham from such schemes, and his lordship was soon propelled towards the far more ambitious project of colonizing America. He was now in his late 50s, so why did the New World consume him in the last years of his life? The avarice of a rapacious old man certainly played a part, but for Popham, it was also about the pursuit of a dumping ground for the criminals that even he, the draconian law officer, could never eradicate. As we have seen, social conditions had produced levels of crime that frightened the gentry. Now, as the century ended, a new crime wave swept over England. This was the price of peace with Spain, for, as ever, when a major war ended, newly released soldiers and mariners spread across the realm. Many of these men had been criminals beforehand and returned to their former profession. In Plymouth, London, Bristol, and York, they had taken the Queen's shilling as an alternative to the rope. In the late 1590s, when war with Spain wound down and peace negotiations began, quote, the land then swarmed with people who had been soldiers, who had never gotten or else quite forgotten any other vocation, too proud to beg, too lazy to labor. These infected the highways with their felonies. In 1597, the year before the Treaty of Vervins officially ended the war, Popham had pushed through Parliament the tough new Vagrancy Act, under which persistent rogues could be banished to parts beyond the seas at the behest of members of the Privy Council. The act was a prelude to what was to come. 5 years later, Popham drew up an order in council identifying those parts of the seas where England's unwanted could be dumped: Newfoundland, the East and West Indies, France, Germany, Spain, and the Low Countries, or any of them. As will be seen, some of these were meant in all seriousness, and Virginia would soon be added to the list. At this point, an enigmatic character entered Popham's life. Sir Ferdinando Gorges was captain and keeper of Plymouth Castle. He was said to be a vain, very avaricious man, hardly any more attractive than Sir John. The two met in 1601 during that most tangled of Tudor dramas, the attempted coup by Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex. Gorges was supposedly an Essex supporter. When the coup began, Essex entrusted him with guarding 3 members of the Queen's Council who were being held in Essex House, the Earl Sumptuous's Thameside Palace. Popham was among the captives. To their surprise, Gorges turned out to be their rescuer rather than jailer, and he had the party rowed upriver to Whitehall in safety. It later transpired that from the beginning, Gorges had leaked details of the plot to Essex's longtime rival, Walter Raleigh, who in turn kept the Queen constantly updated. Gorges was the key witness against Essex when the former royal favorite was tried for treason, condemned, and sent to the block on Tower Hill. While his part in the plot was investigated, Gorges was imprisoned in the Tower. As that other recurrent figure in our story, Sir Thomas Smith had learned any involvement in the Essex plot, however slight, damned you in the old Queen's eyes. Sir Ferdinando found himself held for 9 months and deprived of his military post in Devon. When James I succeeded to the throne, he was immediately reinstated and held in high favor. Gorges backed George Weymouth's 1605 expedition to the North Atlantic coast. Upon his return, Weymouth presented him with 5 members of the Wabanaki and Pemaquid tribes he had captured. The idea was to exhibit them around England to drum up interest in the colonial enterprise. The captives demonstrated their skill in handling a dugout canoe on the River Thames, and according to the Spanish ambassador, Don Pedro de Zúñiga, they were quickly taught English so they could say how good that country America is for people to go there and inhabit it. Gorges wanted Popham's help in his American adventures and presented the Lord Chief Justice with 2 of his Native Americans. The 2 men were soon partners, and they aimed to bring together burghers from London and Plymouth and members of the gentry who had previously invested in expeditions. Top of the list would have been great merchants like Smith and aristocrats like Henry Wriothesley, the brilliant Earl of Southampton, who was William Shakespeare's patron. Most of the lobbying appears to have taken place in the vast new banqueting hall of the Middle Temple, under the coats of arms of Tudor knights that still hang there today, over the heads of other ambitious lawyers. In the winter of 1605 and 1606, Popham approached the Attorney General, Sir Edward Coke. He laid the emphasis not on the riches to be had in America, but on England's desperate need for a dumping ground for criminals. Coke reported their conversation, quote, "My Lord Chief Justice, foreseeing in the experience of his place the infinite number of cashiered captains and soldiers, of poor artisans that would and cannot work, and of idle vagrants that may and will not work, whose increase threatens the state, it is affectionately bent to the plantation of Virginia." He explained that the judge wanted the go-ahead to call the undertakers, gentlemen, merchants, etc., unto him, and by their advice set down the best manner of project, which being agreed upon shall be speedily returned to your lordships, because the best season for the journey approaches. More talks followed, with a great deal of haggling over who was to be in control. Eventually, the Virginia Company was chartered with 2 divisions, a London Company and a Plymouth Company. The charter helped to give birth to a myth. Ostensibly, it was a remarkable document from a king who espoused the divine right to rule and conceded no powers without a struggle. In a section on how the colonies were to be governed, James stated, quote, "I do declare and order that my loving subjects in America shall forever enjoy the right to make all needful laws for their own government, provided only that they be consonant with the laws of England." 260 years later, when the American Civil War, the war to end slavery, had been won by the northern states, the New England historian John A. Poor traced the region's belief in human rights back to James' Charter. "This Charter of Liberties was never revoked," he crowed. Quote, "It was a decree of universal emancipation, and every man of any color, from any clime, was by this act of King James redeemed, regenerated, disenthralled the moment he landed on the soil of America between the 34th and 45th degrees, 150 years before the decree of Lord Mansfield threw off the chains and fetters of Africans in England. That was bullshit. There would be forms of both white and black slavery, even in New England throughout the colonial period. Once the charter was issued for his Plymouth Company, Popham wasted no time. His position as Chief Justice gave him a controlling influence in all the jails and penitentiaries in the realm. Although there is no chapter and verse on his use of convicts, snippets of information from contemporaries leave little doubt that Popham exploited his power. Quote, "He stocked Virginia out of all of the jails of England," reported John Aubrey, the 17th century's master of the biographical sketch. Popham sent out men who were pressed to that enterprise in danger by the law, wrote Earl of Stirling, a confidant of Gorges and later a colonist himself. The image lingers in the mind's eye of the hatchet-faced Popham handing down rough justice, offering convicts facing execution the option that would become commonplace in later decades: slaves for years in exile in America, possibly to die there or go to the gallows. This choice had the happy effect not only of saving lives, but of aiding Sir John's financial endeavors. Likely looking specimens for transportation, the young and strong, would no doubt have been paraded before Sir John for inspection. It is difficult to imagine the Lord Chief Justice of England vetting each felon and vagabond in the notorious foulness of Jacobean jails. The Spanish ambassador to London, Don Pedro de Zuniga, was worried about the threat to Spanish interests in America. He complained to Popham and was assured that colonization aimed only to drive thieves out of England. They were then to be drowned in the sea. In May of 1606, Popham and Gorges organized a trial voyage. A vessel called the Richard was dispatched across the Atlantic with 29 men to establish a bridgehead. Also on board were 2 of the captured Native Americans sent along to act as guides. The expedition put Popham 8 months ahead of the rival London Company, which was fitting out its small fleet in the port of London as Christmas approached. The Richard never made landfall. Her captain, Henry Challens, ignored instructions to sail directly west and took the more traditional and supposedly safer route south, hugging the African coast before turning the helm westwards. He ran straight into a Spanish fleet off San Domingo, and the Richard was captured. Her ship's company and her would-be colonizers ended up as galley slaves. It is thought significant by historians that Popham made no effort to free his colonists. Quote, "It must be admitted," says his biographer, "that he was not full of urgency about the men's recovery. One reason suggested was that, if they were criminals, it was natural that he should leave them to their fate." In a letter to Robert Cecil, Popham wrote, quote, "If the natives were to be had again, in my opinion, it would serve to good purpose," but he made no remarks about the others from the Richard. A year later, the judge was ready to try again, with a much larger expedition. In May of 1607, 120 men shipped out from Plymouth. They sailed in 2 vessels, the Mary and John, captained by Raleigh Gilbert, a son of Sir Humphrey Gilbert, and the wonderfully named Gift of God, a shallow draughted flyboat designed to navigate shallow, unexplored rivers. She was captained by Popham's nephew, George, who was appointed leader of the expedition. Their orders were secret, not to be revealed until they arrived in the New World. Skidwar, one of the tribesmen captured by Weymouth, was sent as a guide. Sir Ferdinando Gorges was still very much involved in the venture, but it was now so much the Lord Chief Justice's project that the colony they planned would be known by everyone, and by history too, as the Popham Colony. Sir Ferdinando, it seems, contented himself with dreaming of his profits. One of his early biographers, the one-time governor of Massachusetts, James Sullivan, described Gorges as wanting a colony run on feudal lines in which he expected to enjoy the profits at his ease without crossing the Atlantic. His expectations were very great. The Gift of God arrived at the mouth of the Kennebec on the 13th of August, and the Mary and John followed 3 days later. The 120 colonists were rowed ashore to the windy headland and gathered together for what was first business of every European expedition to the New World, a service of thanks on dry land. The group thanked the Lord for a safe delivery. Next came the moment all those present had been waiting for, their orders. A list of secret instructions issued by Sir John Popham was taken from the sealed chest in which it had traveled. George Popham read them out. Few details survive, but the imperative was undoubtedly the search for gold. The discovery of mines was the main intended benefit, reported William Strachey, secretary of the Virginia Company, who wrote a history of Virginia in 1612. Woe betide all if gold wasn't found. According to historian George Chalmers, Judge Popham's instructions imperiously required that the interior should be explored for gold, and threatened that in the event of failure the colonists should remain as banished men in Virginia. Convicts probably weren't employed on the search, but labored to construct a star-shaped fort. From surviving records, it appears that the fort was thrown up at a furious pace, mostly by unskilled labor. Walls, church, storehouse, and around 50 wattle and daub dwellings were completed by winter. The trick, it seems, was to use simple building techniques demanding mainly muscle and sweat. George Popham was in charge. He was said to be timorously fearful to offend. His peers, but not, one would suspect, the gangs of men toiling on the banks of the Kennebec that autumn. The very name of Popham would have put the fear of God into most of them. Plans began to go awry early. The search for mines of gold or silver was led by 24-year-old Raleigh Gilbert. Week after week they found nothing. Skidwaras deserted back to his people, and relations with the local Wawanok, Kanabas, and Narrasagundukuk peoples, initially promising, turned sour. The colonists' behavior was to blame. After one incident, when 4 tribesmen were dragged by their hair aboard the Gift of God, an attack was mounted and 14 colonists were killed. Then, inordinately grim winter descended, and all the time, not a speck of gold. A sudden piece of dramatic news appeared to have transformed their fortunes. Members of the Abenaki tribe told Popham and Gilbert about a huge stretch of water just 7 days' walk away. George Popham wrote a breathless letter to King James, claiming the greatest discovery of the new century. Quote, "This cannot be other than the Southern Ocean reaching to the regions of China." They had, he claimed, found the fabled Northwest Passage. It was, of course, nonsense. The tribesmen were almost certainly referring to Moosehead Lake. What became known as the ill-fated Popham colony soon ended. After less than a year and a terrible winter, George Popham died, believing he had established a permanent foothold in the New World and would go down in history. Quote, "I die content. My name will always be associated with the first planting of the English race in the New World. My remains will not be neglected, away from the home of my fathers and my kindred." George Popham was wrong. He was forgotten, and so, almost, was the colony. Raleigh Gilbert took over the leadership, supposedly with great plans for expansion. Instead, he packed up and went home. His change of heart surprised everyone, but not for long. The Mary and John had just returned from England, packed with provisions and with news. Gilbert's brother, Sir John Gilbert, was dead. Raleigh was heir to his estate and title. It must have been a bombshell for the youngest of 7 children, forced to seek his fortune in the New World, but he did not hesitate. He was going home. There had been another death, too. This was the news that really gripped the colony. Sir John Popham had died. The ogre was no more. No retribution for failure awaited them on the quay at Plymouth. Everybody could now go home, and everybody did. The Popham colony left for England en masse, leaving the fort to decay. The colony had lasted little more than a year, and the colonists returned with little more than a few hundred furs. Most of those involved blamed the dreadful winter. Across the northern hemisphere, it had been the worst in memory. Sir Ferdinando Gorges wrote, "All our hopes have been frozen to death." The returning colonists reported that America was overcold, and in respect of that, not habitable by our nation. In years to come, some patriotic American historians expressed relief that the venture had failed. Quote, "The abortion of Sagahadoki was the first, the last, and the only attempt of the English corporation to fasten a moral pestilence on our northern shores. The Popham colony might have failed, but its philosophy would be revived many miles to the south, where the rival colony, named Jamestown, succeeded in putting down permanent roots. Within a decade, convicts and other representatives of England's cast-offs would begin to arrive in the New World with the king's blessing.